Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this parallel session. It's the second parallel session for today. The topic is driving excellence and sustainability through strategic financial planning. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our panelists today, or discussants. First up, we have Professor Tawana Kupe, and I'm going to read his bio. Professor Kupe is the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria. He holds a BA Honours and Master's degree in English from the University of Zimbabwe. Welcome, Professor Kupe. And a DPhil in Media Studies from the University of Oslo, Norway. Professor Kupe is the Africa Co-Chair of the Australia-Africa Universities Network since 2019, and an honorary doctorate in humanities was bestowed on him by Michigan State University in December 2019. Professor Kupe has a notable publication record, having authored journal articles, books, book chapters in his main discipline, which is media studies and journalism. He has played a key role in the establishment of select new innovative initiatives at WITS, of which the latest in 2018 was the Africa Center for the Studies of the United States. He is an active member of several civil society organizations. He's also the chairperson of the Board of Media Monitoring Africa since 2005. He has been a judge and convener of multiple major journalism awards in South Africa, and is a member of the Council of the International Association of Media and Communication Research, as well as the Association of the Commonwealth Universities Council. Professor Kupe is a popular invited speaker, academic expert, and regular commentator on issues of media performance on radio, television, the print media in South Africa, both locally and internationally. I now move on to introducing Mr. Sizwe Nkosana. Sizwe is the founder and CEO of Future Nation School, very exciting initiative, and chairperson of ICASASA Student Financial Aid Program, which funds a very important component of the missing middle students. He has also founded Sizwe & Co., which is a KwaZulu-Natal's first Black audit firm in 1989, and in 1996, he became a founding member of the Nkonki Sizwe Ntsaluba, which is also referred to as SNG Grant Thompson. He's a co-founder, 2030, and chairman of the National Education Collaboration Trust, as a response to the call by the National Development Plan for increased collaboration among stakeholders to improve educational outcomes. He was the chairperson of USAf since 2015 and 2018. Ntasana was the CEO of the first RAND banking group for 10 years, and before that, the CEO of Telkom SA for 8 years. He's the director of the Solidarity Fund and chairs the fundraising committee. A warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. Our last discussant is Mr. Hardy Maritz, and he has been appointed as the acting executive director from 28 August 2020 until a suitable appointment is made. He is currently a finance professional with 20-year track record in higher education leadership, with wide-ranging experience in financial management, cash flow planning and forecasting, strategic planning, governance, systems and projects, and executive support and training. Hardy joined UCT in 1999 and has fulfilled the role of managing and collating all aspects of annual fee setting or negotiation, budgeting, and management reporting processes. In addition, he played a key role as part of a new finance executive team under the leadership of Professor Enrico Uliana, who managed and reshaped the finances of the institution to place it on a sustainable financial footing. In January 2016, Maritz was appointed Director Group Finance at UCT, and his portfolio was expanded to include taking line management responsibilities for financial accounting, debtors, treasury, and banking, as well as retaining management accounting. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon to engage in this very critical conversation. With all your background and experience, we do look forward to having a very interesting conversation with you. I would now like to hand over to Professor Coupe to start the conversation. Thanks, Professor Coupe.
Thank you, Bernadette. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists, and good afternoon to the people participating in this discussion session. First, I would like to start off by saying that if it was a paper that I was given or a written presentation, I'll call it Rethink, Reimagine, and Reposition. And I might end up with this if I have time, or expand on that during the discussion. Second, what I want to say in this very welcome discussion this afternoon is that everything I say here is predicated on the following background. We live in an age of multiple continuous disruptions of the world as we know it. And this is not just about COVID. Some of these disruptions have been happening for a couple of decades, if not more. One, for example, being technological disruption in the higher education space, and also leading to discussions about online teaching and learning. We might come back to that. But also there have been other disruptions beyond the academy, if you like. Political uncertainty and weak leadership, economies that are in trouble and no longer able to provide for all they need to provide, including education as a public good, and also private sector companies under distress. And this is global, it's not just South African, it's not just African. Then also there are multiple social crises. Then of course the ecological and environmental crises. That is why it is important in discussing notions of excellence and strategic financial planning to be able to think that we are actually much more is required of us, not just tinkering. So in the higher education space, let me also add, we also have a problem that we do not actually have a higher education system per se. We have an inherited system that we have tinkered and done some patchwork over time and not rethought it for the kind of society that we want. One of also my assumptions here is that excellence and notions of financial strategic planning must actually be clear about what is the purpose of higher education and education in general. For me, it is impact in multiple forms. Impact on individuals who are developed to become part of the necessary, relevant human capital at any point in the development of a national society. And second, knowledge that actually transforms lives, transforms communities, business sectors, transforms a society and a nation, makes a contribution to the continent and the world. So that's some of my predications. So we don't have a high, and now higher education system pertinent to this topic. We inherited a system of funding and financing that is no longer adequate and in some instances no longer relevant. The way in which subjects or programs are subsidized is no longer relevant for the times that we face and for the future. So it's related to a lack of the education system. I don't want to forget here is that we also do not have an articulated education system. And here, I mean, we don't have an articulated education system that is anchored on sustainably funded early childhood education that is compulsory, and then that links up to a tertiary sector that is not just going to university after matric. That technical and TVET college sector is fairly weak, to put it lightly. As a result, you get a situation where people get to university when they are not ready for university. And also that adds to the financial pressures of universities. I'm not going to elaborate here in the huge financial leakages of students who, because they are not very well prepared, they can't complete programs at university and fall out or take too long for programs or need extra support that has to be budgeted for universities that care to do that. Some don't, and also for people who take longer than they should, leading to a degradation of the subsidy that goes to a particular university. So all of those things are very, very important in what we ought to do. So for me, then excellence is actually having the relevant programs that will give human capital necessary for a particular stage. There are too many of our programs in multiple universities that perhaps should now be phased out, and they do not necessarily serve a purpose. But I'm not one of those people who believe that all programs will be subject to the ring of the marketplace. The marketplace has a role in shaping programs, and there are ways of doing that. I'm happy to expand later on. But also there are programs that actually, in a sense, give people certain particular kind of skills that lead them actually to gain other skills in the workplace in partnership with universities. We also need a higher education system if it's going to be sustainable for each institution financially and intellectually, that allows pathways for lifelong education. That is also, if you like, particularly lacking. I would like, therefore, to go on to say, what do I envision would be a driving excellence and then also a strategic financial planning. I've occupied many roles in my life, beginning with as a head of department when I was a young man. And I also had the fortune or misfortune at one point, not being an accountant, to be a deputy vice chancellor for finance and operations at Wits University, and to run a faculty that had been put under administration because its financial planning was not proper. Two things I learned from there, which are very important: that the program mix and the program relevance to the workplace more broadly, not just the private sector, was very, very important. And that also agile and flexible management was very, very important. That understanding the financing and funding and the subsidy systems was important. Third, that fundraising, which is what I'm driving in my current position, was an important contributor to changing the mix of the financial, the way in which the institution is actually funded. But that attracting fundraising was very to attract fundraising, it was very, very key to have multiple relations with the philanthropy sector, the private sector, and the public sector and civil society, which would actually, in a sense, see a funding a university as an investment in the necessary skills and knowledge that they want. Third, of course, I think that higher education and driving excellence and strategic financial planning is not about just teaching and learning or people getting degrees. It's not a transactional relationship. It's also about the knowledge production element of it, which we normally call research. And then there are multiple dimensions of research. There's blue sky research, knowledge-driven research in order to pursue intellectual topics, but also there is research that is for innovation and commercialization, and also commissioned research to address complex problems in society. That occupying that mix in a strategic fashion and indicating which programs are able to do that, or organizing programs to do that, also drives not only production of excellent knowledge, but knowledge that is impact in transforming society, and also brings in multiple revenue scales. Now, leaving, I presume, Bernadette, have 2 minutes left or is it 3 minutes left for my opening gambit?
Yes, that's right. 2
Okay,
minutes.
then this is what I suggest that going forward, if you want to really drive excellence that is meaningful, that matters to rescuing a society in trouble and putting it into a trajectory where it is much more prosperous, much more equitable, much more, if you like, enables everyone to realize their potential, is one, an articulated education system, not just higher education system. Second, moving away from the kinds and forms of teaching and programs we have run. So we need deep and genuine curriculum reform and transformation, where in particular fields, there's a partnership between the public sector, the private sector, and civil society in what goes into the curriculum and also what students learn, and a multitude of opportunities for internships, workplace learning, and all of that, and industry and related advisory boards that actually partner with the university. Second, in research and even in program development, we need a major turn to what I call that transdisciplinary turn. I've described some of the elements of a transdisciplinary turn. So in research, co-creation of knowledge, academics breaking or universities breaking the silos between forms of knowledge, and making a distinction between what you want to teach things in understandable ways and how knowledge can be used to address complex, complicated, messy. It's across disciplines, but not just across disciplines. It's not just multidisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary, where you cross borders. But transdisciplinary also means doing research in partnership with societal sectors, be government, business, and civil society, and also co-creating knowledge that actually addresses complex problems facing society. To use something that is fairly easy to reflect is to create knowledge and teach programs that enable people to address the sustainable development goals. In my environment, I've seen that it is actually bringing in a lot of funding and will, if we sustain this momentum after the transdisciplinary platforms and transdisciplinary degree programs that are relevant to real life issues, not just bringing knowledge looking for a problem, but bringing knowledge that actually addresses the situation. But that requires also on the government side to change the subsidy model and to subsidize transdisciplinary programs, transdisciplinary research, and to rethink and throw away the outmoded subsidy funding model that we inherited from our past. And also to always be focused on impact. The impact must not only be academic, medals, citations, all of that, but also impact in actually addressing societal challenges. I'll stop there for now.
Oh, I want to, right. Thank you so much, Professor Coupe, for that insightful input and discussion and a clear focus on the importance of impact. I'd like to now hand over to Mr. Nkosana to take us through his thoughts regarding excellence Sorry, not excellence, we're looking at sustainability and resilience. So could I hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Dr. Bernadette Johnson, and thanks to Prof. Tawanakupe for opening the session for us. I'm going to ask for my presentation to be shared. Yeah, thank you very much. If we just move straight to the first slide. Just following on from the point that's been made by Professor Kupe, I do think that there are a number of things just very practically that need to be addressed in terms of how the funding of the system actually works. As we know, at the moment, when you go through the budgets, whether it's a medium-term expenditure framework or the minister's statement, we have so essentially two broad categories of how the university system is funded. You have block grants and earmark grants. And I do think that when one looks at this, just going back to the point that Prof. Kupe was making, is that we need to really rethink the whole process of how the grant system actually works, because at the moment, you know, we have a number of degrees and programs that are offered by universities that actually do not really meet what the country needs. And I fully agree. I mean, the universities are there to produce knowledge, and of course, they have to operate in the context of our economy and so on. And so I do think that it is time, and it's a pity that because of things that happened, especially with hashtag Fees Must Fall, the process by government of reviewing the subsidy system has been delayed. It is long overdue for review, because I do think that when you look at, for instance, just where we are as a country, there are a number of areas where in the block grant, we have teaching inputs and outputs, research inputs and outputs as an example. But when you look at the financials of the various 26 public universities, you'll realize that we sit with a number of programs that are low demand, that are not really, you know, adding any value to society as such, and they continue to obviously get subsidies. When you look at the enrollment numbers in some of these programs, they are really low, which make them unviable. And therefore, there is a need to revisit this. It is also important to look at the whole issue of the role of university. And this was a discussion and presentation by the minister, the CEO, Prof. Ahmed Bauer, as well as the discussants that were part of the panel this morning, Dr. Sizwe Mabizela, you know, Prof. Mutwa, and, you know, in the morning session, where I think that there's a lot that the system, in other words, the government system can do to incentivize, especially the partnership between universities and other social partners. And this also includes how the broader economy, including the local economies, you know, can be promoted, and so that we can grow our economy. And I think just looking at the formula, the block grant, as well as some of the earmark grants, there's certainly a major opportunities there for us to change the way that you know, the policy creates the necessary environment for our country to move forward. But just look at the next slide. It is also important, I think it's fair to say that when you look at, again, the government policy, it recognizes distance education, it recognizes contact education. It does not really recognize where the country is going, in fact, where the world is going in terms of blended learning. The subsidies for online or even distance education you know, are not really where they should be. They're about half of what they are for contact. And as all institutions are moving to blended learning, or even, you know, move to online, I think it will be really particularly important for the category of online to be created. And we see this across the board. I mean, even, you know, just going back to the point that Prof. Kupe was making around the unarticulated system in our country. The basic education system does not have a category of online schools. So there are a lot of players, including some of the existing public schools in the country, as an example, that have launched online schools. At the moment, you can only do it to serve customers whose children are registered for homeschooling. So there isn't a category called online. So likewise, in the higher education space, particularly in the university space, there is a need to look at this particular category called online and incentivize or subsidize it appropriately if we're going to grow it. So I'm hoping that the ministerial task team that the minister was talking about this morning is going to address this issue, because we know that in this country, there's much, much higher demand for university education than there is available seats and spaces. If you look at the enrollment plans and the enrollment capacity in our system. And I think this presents an opportunity for us to fast track our country so that we can move towards a much more integrated, multidisciplinary approach, but also a more blended approach of how we offer the program from certificates to macro credentials to postgrad and so on. And there is an important area here, which even for the financial sustainability of universities is quite important, because as I was saying earlier on, at the moment, when it comes to financial aid, as an example for students, you have a lot of students who want to get to online degrees. They're not classified as qualifying, even if in terms of their means test, in other words, their household income, they qualify, for instance, for NSFAS. But if they want to pursue degrees online, they cannot do that under the current dispensation. So there's a whole ecosystem which has to be addressed in this country. And part of that ecosystem is sorting out the whole issue of the infrastructure and the platforms that the country needs to create. I think, if you look at the TENET system, which is the system around broadband access at universities, that system, yes, provides an opportunity for reform, but there's a whole area which includes devices, the zero rating or significant discounting of broadband access, because we can't have a situation in our country, which is what we've seen, where it's up to each university to go and negotiate with the service providers like MTN, Telkom, Vodacom, and CLC and others, when the system as a whole is completely disconnected to what should be happening. If I look at, for instance, I worked in the telecoms space as a CEO of Telkom for 8 years, and there are decisions that were made more than 15 years ago that have never been implemented. We have the Universal Assets and Service Agency, which is sitting with just over almost 1.5 billion rand, and they're supposed to provide access, especially if you look at the historically Black universities in this country. And they're not doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, let alone the schools. I mean, out of the 25,000 schools that we have in the country, only just over 6,000 schools are connected and have internet access. So there's a whole ecosystem that we need to create. But whilst we're waiting for that to happen, universities, I'm sure, have seen what has happened with COVID, that there's a need for proper integrated strategies that deal with how we deal and coordinate broadband access and internet access, whilst we're also dealing with devices. If you could just look at the next slide. The other issue, which is really important, is to, especially in the context of promoting the economy, promoting local economies, I don't think universities in this country are doing enough. And this is a point that came out clearly this morning in all the discussions from the minister to Prof. Bauer to the other panel members, including Professor Francis Peterson, that there are a number of areas. Universities seem to want to be the same in this country. They want to be similar, and they're not really exploiting the competitive advantage which they have around the local economies. Yes, of course, we, in the process of doing so, must recognize that we need to build Pan-African universities. If we just look at agriculture as an example, and I look at some of the universities that sit in the north of our country, I think these universities should be playing a much, much bigger role, for instance, in promoting and researching and developing innovations and solutions in agriculture, not just for our country, for the rest of the continent. And when I look at the faculties that sit in some of these universities, and I won't really mention them by name, but they sit in the north of our country, in the basket, of our nation, food basket of our nation, I think there's a huge opportunity for them to play a much bigger role in the local communities, as well as nationally, as well as Pan-Africanly, if you just look at that. And there are a number of other sectors which universities are not really leveraging, for the benefit of themselves in terms of research and innovation, but also for the benefit of the communities locally or as well as nationally. The next slide. I do think, the last couple of years have presented a couple of challenges, but I would like to look at them as opportunities. And just going back to the point that Prof. Cooper was making, I've done the analysis. I've just been sitting over the last 3 weeks or so, going through the financial statements and the annual reports of all 26 public universities. And I could only find about 3 or 4 universities that are doing the proper costing of their PQM in terms of how that affects the programs which they offer and how revenues and costs are allocated across different faculties. In a lot of other universities, things sort of go into one melting pot. And that means that you find a number of cases where the PQM is including a lot of programs that are really unviable. And because the costing is not properly done, universities continues to leak and in fact, really inefficient, utilize the resources which they have, which could be releasing a lot of money for instance, I mean, we've seen a significant increase in part-time contract lecturers in universities. And if universities could just address the issue of cost efficiency of their programs, that could release a lot of money. And I'm particularly talking here to the HBUs and the universities of technology, and they are more affected by this issue. And that could release a lot of money for them to really invest in the core academic programs which they have in the university. The other issue which has happened since especially #FeesMustFall is a culture of non-payment. It's really, when I looked at the years, particularly from 2017 to date to the end of 2019, the amount of unpaid fees at universities has increased to almost half of the tuition and fee income of all public universities. And this is quite a major issue because, this amount of money is really, in a lot of cases, universities have to write off this money because it cannot be collected. So we created a culture within the administrations themselves where the culture of collecting money properly has been, decreased over the years, but also the culture from students and parents not to pay, what they should be paying. And it's something that as a country, we need to really address as a matter of urgency because it has a huge impact on the viability, the success, as well as the level and standards and quality of universities that we have in our country. It's an issue that we can it's low-hanging fruit, and we can do something about for the benefit of the sustainability of our system. As I conclude, it is really important that the university administrations that address some of the issues which they have control to do something about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for opening up our minds to those areas as well as the culture of non-payment. It's a very interesting and also controversial space sometimes. So thank you for opening that part of the conversation up as well. I'd now like to hand over to the next speaker, who is Hardy Maritz, and please, I hand over to you. We look forward to your discussion.
Thanks, Bernadette. Before I get into the presentation, perhaps 1 or 2 comments and observations on the presentations made both by Tawana and by Sizwe. And I mean, some of the ones raised there are ones, as they've both said, are not new ones, but ones that we always seem to avoid. So, take the typical one there of the PQM costing. Even just the notion of, in some ways, having minimum course sizes. If you have a broadly humanities-based undergraduate course and you have fewer than, what is the number? I mean, I tend to put it out at 25 to 30 and my academic colleagues look at me in horror. But if you go back and understand the sort of basic cost drivers around those things, if you're not getting class sizes on a 3 to 4 year rolling basis of at least 20 to 25, you shouldn't be running the program. So the point, I think, is one that's very well made, as is the one of we're very good at adding additional courses, but we're not great at discontinuing them. And when you unpack that even at a more detailed level, what you then notice over time is that many of our universities now have what I call credit overload, and certainly my academic DVC concurs. When we go back and look, we're teaching students a whole lot more. We expect them to do way more than the minimum credit loads, but we're giving them less time to do it. And then we also start wondering why we have some of the mental health and other challenges in universities that existed prior to the year we've just had. So again, I think it's more than just simply looking at the mix and what's not viable. It sort of gets to the points that Prof. Cooper makes around curricular reform and looking at how do we teach these things? How do we go more transdisciplinary? How do we focus on what people need? And again, how do we equip them for lifelong learning rather than you will be an accountant and you'll be an accountant for 40 years as a career. So I think there are a lot of opportunities down that road. I think the other one to pick up is the issue around funding sources and how the state, I guess, influences what they do. I mean, we've talked about reviews of the funding framework. There's been 2 or 3 in my time within the sector. There's some that still remain to be done, but we drive some really poor behavior, for lack of a better way of putting it, by some of those incentives. So again, I think trying to focus those on longer term aims and outcomes, and certainly using, again, I think as Sizwe put it really well, what does the country need, and what do we think about in terms of where we go? How do we educate more people? How do we educate them when they're in remote areas? Sizwe touched on trying to this year. I mean, I'll use UCT as an example, but we're not unique. We spent an order of 2.5 million rand a month trying to connect students who are in remote areas. In some cases, we're not even able to do that because they don't have any. So again, as soon as you want to move to blended online, which I think are ways we should be going, those sort of challenges arise. So I just thought I'd comment on 1 or 2 of those before I move into my presentation, which takes a slightly different look at how we contemplate, I guess, the strategic financial planning aspects. So being the finance person on the panel, I've sort of taken a view that says, how do we think about things given both our current challenges and then also, in terms of where we see things going? So in the context of COVID-19 and sort of short-term, I guess, responses, some of the underpins that we've got to think about now also underpin long-term, particularly you consider things from a financial perspective. So, in terms of thinking ahead, there may be a couple of things to think about, and some of these have come into sharp relief in looking at how we think about COVID-19. So perhaps the first one to contemplate is optimism bias, and that sort of underpins not just our planning every day, but it's sort of become more and more to the fore as we sort of go through the COVID-19 responses, but also as we try and plan and react faster and be more agile. So I mean, the term optimism bias is one, and so I was reminding my executive the other day that when we sat and sort of anticipated what may come under COVID-19 conditions back in February and March, when we sort of contemplated that we would probably be in this position in around September of this year, a lot of people said to us we were being hopelessly pessimistic. And I give it to you, we're sitting in November, and I suspect November, December, and we probably expect 2021 to look pretty much the same. So it's not just COVID-19 thinking, but when you think about how you plan for the future, what you plan for, again, the idea is to avoid both optimism bias in terms of how you think about those and how you think about events that may come, but also think about them more holistically. I think the other thing that COVID-19 has thrown into sharp relief is the idea of student mobility. And to some extent, this is international students, but to some extent, it's also the thought that perhaps the students who are at your university do not need to be resident at university. So the idea again there of more blended learning, that maybe you have, modules that are on campus, maybe in a very different way going forward. I think one of the interesting things we've seen, particularly around international students, is first off, fees must fall and the roads must fall protests for the institutions in South Africa that had large numbers of international students. We saw a mass exodus. So first off, we kind of learned to manage those from a financial point of view. But what we also have seen again now under COVID-19 conditions is, although those students are back in their home countries, they are still very much looking for what they gain out of participating in programs and courses in South African universities. And even if they're not the in-person experiences we would have always thought they wanted, we've been quite taken aback by how many students who are sitting abroad really actually want to continue engaging in classes, even if they're online and blended mode. So again, I think when we think about student mobility, we've learned some aspects through the COVID-19 responses, but I think there's also some lessons for the longer term in that. I think the other thing that's thrown into sharp contrast in sort of how we think about sustainability more broadly is, when I joined UCT in late 1999, what I was taken aback by was it operated on what I call the great benefactor theory. And what I mean by that, it's very much endemic to state-funded institutions, where as long as you spend your money you have for this year, sort of within the broad tramlines of it, the great benefactor will write you another check next year. So no one particularly worries about, well, what happens the year after that? And thinking about sustainability, what happens if the great benefactor runs out of money? So part of what we reshaped at UCT in the early years was first off, broadly thinking about finances and related in business terms, where what are the decisions we take now look like 5 and 10 years out? What do we have to spend money on in terms of changing things to support our strategies, to support our aims and ambitions? Where do we want to be 5 or 10 years down the line, and what do we have to do to get there? So again, sustainability, not just in the short term of making sure the bottom line, is sustainable, I guess, but also long term, investing in what we need to invest in to make sure that our institution moves with the times, that it has the funds available to invest in what it needs to. That's been something that I think a lot of universities in South Africa have battled with, and it's one I think is not hard to fix, but it does mean you've got to think longer term and have the appropriate tools, thoughts, and I guess professionals to actually do that. The last one is also, again, a response we've seen around COVID-19, but it applies just as much around COVID-19 as it does in others. And I call it the strategic compass. So as much as at the moment we're all going through quite tough times, we've seen in some cases reductions in state subsidy both this year, but I certainly expect it to happen both in 2021 and 2022. We've seen increasing pressure on where we have some third stream revenues, depending on where those are. If they're related to the academic project, well, some of them may have dropped off, some of them may have not. We have had investments in the hospitality industry for a long time, and they've been pretty good investments. They've generated significant funding to support the academic project, but in 2020 they've fallen off a cliff. So again, are those things we should just throw out with the bathwater? No. Again, we've got our plans in place. We know that long term, those businesses and those investments will continue to support our academic and research endeavors. But by the same token, investments we're making into our strategy that we made decisions on last year and the year before, even this year, it's very important that we still actually carve out the resources we need to actually keep on investing in those strategies, assuming they're still relevant. So again, do a quick recheck. Yep, they're still relevant. If they are, make sure you actually continue investing in those and don't abandon that strategic direction just because you're under pressure in the current year. So again, I think try and think about those in the bigger picture around particularly being sustainable. So I think if you manage to remain sustainable, you have the funds to invest in being excellent, but as well as thinking through the points made by the previous speakers, both around how you think about the university system, but also in terms of how you think about what the system funds, what it teaches, how it teaches, and what it researches and how it does that. I think, again, the current pandemic also gives rise to some interesting shifts in terms of what we may see the next 5 to 10 years. And maybe these sort of inform where that strategic compass points, but also, I guess, in some sense, it's prioritization of resources. So I mean, to give you a sense overall, if you look currently in the last couple of weeks at debt to GDP numbers, you've got European countries sitting anywhere between 80 and 140% debt to GDP. South Africa is not great either, but again, the outlook is probably substantially harder for the state in terms of choices it makes, what it has to fund, and again, how it sort of funds key things. We talked earlier on about funding basic and preschool education appropriately. I cannot stress anymore that I think that's probably one of the most important areas, and probably also at the same time one of the most neglected areas of our education system. Once you get a child to grade 4, grade 5 even, and they're unable to have the basics of mathematics and language skills, I think it's very hard to rescue it from there. So, you know, it's a hard choice to make, but given what we spend on those sort of things, it may well make a lot of sense for the state to refocus its attention on the really lower end of basic education and get that preschool and grade 1 to 5 working really, really well. I think it sets everything else up from there really, really well. So in terms of other possibilities, we think about research and innovation funding. I mean, I think what will happen in that space, it's happened already, and I think it will continue to happen. Certainly, if we think about state funding of those in South African terms, I think we're going to see a big hit on those. I think the state will have less available. But I do think you'll find more public sector, and I think some of the focus will certainly boost areas like health surveillance, vaccine development. I think, again, if you think about C19 vaccines, they're now being tested less than a year after the pandemic hit. The long-term view on vaccines is they've taken somewhere between 15 and 18 years to develop. If you just think about what that means for advances in healthcare and for focuses on those things. The next big one is one we haven't dealt with yet, climate change. And again, if we think about sustainability more broadly, I think that's the next big one. So again, we think about transdisciplinary endeavors. Things around climate change, they're not just sitting in, you know, how you may mine things, how you produce things, how you account for things. Those are really transdisciplinary in ways that you look at them. So again, I think we will see more and more funding available to research climate change, to find new solutions to what we have. And so that's probably an area to think about as well in terms of how we structure our programs, talking back to the relevance of them. How many of us have cross-cutting faculty programs or even research that focus on the various aspects of climate change? It's here now. It's one that I think a lot of us probably have not thought about as broadly as we should. I think the other thing to think about in terms of where we find ourselves now is how we react to extreme uncertainty. So a lot of us have we sort of revert back to, I guess, our comfort zones in some sense as well. This worked in the past. Let's think about it in the same terms. I think it makes a lot of sense to try and step out of that comfort zone. Think about different solutions, different ways of approaching the problem. I think plan and evaluate faster is the other one. So fail forward and fail fast. Look at the environment around you. And again, I think even in times of uncertainty like we have now, you keep on forecasting. You may have to do it a lot faster. It may be a lot harder. But in terms of thinking about that strategic compass, where do we want to be? How do we want to reshape ourselves? The idea of planning faster and even though it becomes harder, it remains more important than ever, because without a plan or a way to fund that, you almost never get to change. Sort of as Cesar said earlier, you just kind of continue to exist. I think the other thing to think about in terms of the sort of extreme uncertainty is also perspective. So again, I think looking at how we imagine the higher education system we have at present, where we'd like it to be 5, 10, 15 years down the line, take a step back, look at perspective, look at what employers are looking for, look at where the current generation looks at things. Now, I have a daughter who's just finished grade 10, and I've made points to both my current VC and prior ones that I have a grade 10 student who's 2 years away from entering university, who looks at most of the current universities and says, I'm not sure I fit there. And again, you want to make changes. That person is 2 years away from being in your institution and yet can't really find a home. And you sort of go back to the points that Tawana made earlier. It gets back to the transdisciplinary. How many of our degrees are still really siloed in basic sort of disciplines around accounting, engineering, sciences? More cross-disciplinary teaching as well, and sort of, I guess, a more cross-pollinated curriculum. Certainly in my sense of when I look around at current sort of teenagers and people who will be in our institutions in anywhere between 3 and 5 years' time, that's what they're looking for, and very few of us offer that. And then finally, without anything around the balance, we've got to kind of think about cash and cash flows. So sort of in tangential points to the ones Sizwe and Tawana have made is, if you make choices about what you stop doing, whether it's inefficient, whether it's something that's no longer in demand. You know, I use an example quite often in my discussions with my academic colleagues of European languages, whether it be Greek, whether it be Spanish or others, that in the Western Cape, we have 4 institutions that are state funded. And I think 3 of us all have departments that teach those languages. When you go back and look at student numbers among us for the last 10 years, you see student numbers of 10 to 15 on those programs. Why don't we sit down together and say, well, Stellenbosch, how about you teach Greek, UCT, we'll teach Spanish, and maybe UWC, you teach Latin or whatever it may be, but we never seem to get to that point. And again, some state intervention might help, but I think it's also time we do that off our own bat and actually, again, consolidate stuff that we think we have to make sure the numbers work at one institution. But on the other hand, the points again Sizwe made is think about our institutions as having unique advantages rather than us all offering, I guess, cookie cutter degrees and things that are not massively differentiated when they really could be. But to do all that, again, you've got to have the plan, you've got to have the cash to do it, and you've actually got to make the choices. Part of the crisis we see now for a lot of institutions is that they don't have good cash flow planning. They've always had the great benefactor theory apply. And when you now start seeing fees under pressure, when you start seeing state subsidies under pressure, you're going to start having institutions fall over or run into cash flow problems quite quickly. There are some institutions who have had that problem already this year where they're sort of looking the other way to try and make payroll. That's not a position we want any of our institutions to be in. So again, the more we sort of help the executives within institutions understand what sustainability is, how to look at things on a 5 and 10-year horizon, but also to manage the cash in the bank. You know, without cash in the bank, you don't have any choices. You sort of have your back up against the wall and you're faced with making decisions in crisis mode. And invariably in crisis mode, we don't make good decisions and choices. Thanks, Bernadette. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Hardy. I noticed on my side, I only saw your first slide. I didn't see the others.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if anybody else saw them.
Okay, but is it okay if we also just share your slides with people in the chat?
Of course, not a problem.
Thank you. Okay, so those were really, really very interesting discussions, and I would just really like to thank the discussants for opening up the conversation in the ways in which they have. At this stage, I'd like to invite you, you're welcome to put up your hand and to come in and to raise a comment or a question from the attendees. And Birgit, who I'm working with, is the moderator. She will be checking up on the hands to see who's coming in. Okay, so while we've invited you to do that and to come in whenever it's convenient for you, I just want to get a second round perhaps and just ask a question. What stood out for me from this morning session, which I found was quite interesting, was the idea of the image of the butterfly and a dainty and very dainty and fragile, but yet the impact has a ripple effect throughout the system. And that got me thinking about theories of change. What I also heard Sizwe Nkosana talk about, I actually wrote it down. When you were reflecting on your time at Telkom, you made a statement and you said, decisions made more than 15 years ago have not been implemented. And it made me think that is the story as well, to some extent, of higher education. I think Professor Cooper spoke about, when talking about the PQM, when talking about, and Hardy as well, there was a lot of synergy between the presentations, talking about the importance of not just adding on, but thinking, where do we tweak? Where do we differentiate? Where do we ensure and enhance relevance? And so my question really to you is, as we think about excellence and sustainability, I keep on asking myself the question, and Hardy, you said perhaps it's not just about, it's also about what are we doing to bring about these changes within institutions. And so I was wondering, what do you think might be some of the barriers within institutions? What has been stopping us from pushing these aspects of the agenda forward, reviewing the PQM in ways that make impact, Professor Coupe, reviewing and your experience from Telkom as well, Sizwe, and then Hardy, your reflections exactly on that point. What is it that you think is holding us back? And with that, what could we do more of that can push us forward? I'll just allow for a round as we wait for hands to come up.
So if I may,
Please.
yeah. So you see, I think that one of the things, like I said before, I started off at Rhodes University in 1999. Then I went to Wits, where I was there for 16 years or something. And I'm grateful to Wits because I was able to arrive there and start a department that did not exist.
Yes.
In an area, to be fair to them, that indicated would attract students. So there was some financial modeling, although no proper budget. For a few years, I had to teach so many classes on my own. Ironically, by the way, side comment, and that's also interesting at UP, I was more productive both in research and students and engaging my industry than when I thought I had too much work. But I think the problem here is the lack of agile, adaptable management and systems, and lack of continuous reflection, reimagination, and actually repositioning. Certain people, there's a tendency, I think, to confuse the longevity of the institution and its ability to be dynamic in the space. Universities are lifelong institutions. They will always be there like the church, right? But that doesn't mean they have to do the things the same way. So let's take the issue of online teaching and learning. I'm doing this deliberately, and I'll explain why. Technological disruption has been with us, I think, for quite a long time. In the area in which I teach, media and communications and IT, technological disruption was happening as late 90s, where I went to do my PhD. We had a new media lab funded by Telkom Norway, because Telkom Norway could see where things were going. We could see as academics where things were going, that will emerge a new media industry that will disrupt the old industry. And we were doing that in a university, but we didn't quite carry it through to our own teaching, if you like. So fast forward to the COVID. COVID now kicks everybody to move on online teaching. But what we're doing now is remote emergency teaching and learning. And also it's not something we chose to do. We were forced to do it. And by the way, online teaching 100% is not appropriate for everything. All right. And also, if you don't do that, you're going to lose the plot in terms of your strategy and even lose students. People forget a debate about MOOCs. Do you remember times when MOOCs spread from all over the US and people said universities will vanish, they will disappear, and people went there? MOOCs actually showed that for a full qualification, many people did not complete. They lacked the human contact and complementing the online. So actually there we have to think both strategically, very carefully, and in a nuanced way. So let me give a practical example. So what we have at UP, because of fees must fall, they'd already moved into what we call hybrid teaching and learning, or blended model, where students at UP must go online before they come to class. They will be online in a contact class and go back online after class. We call it prepare, engage, and consolidate. That does wonders. But when you throw people wholly online without that human interaction, we've been doing a serious monitoring and evaluation. And I'm happy to share some of our reports at every stage during this pandemic to actually find out what were people doing online, how long were they online, what levels of interactivity were there during class. We have 3 or 4 reports like that, and we want to do, and also surveying the students and surveying the staff. It's simply not true that it's very easy to teach online and it's very easy to study online and to get all of the content. Most people want also an element of contact. The future, therefore, is hybrid. However, not everything is going to be hybrid. So at UP, we're thinking of dividing it this way: UP contact, UP hybrid, and UP online. So there will be some programs that are 100% online, including courses, but there might be elements of contact as well. That is the future. Now, it needs agility and flexibility to do that. And the pandemic is a big masterclass for doing that. But it also means that you have to rethink the financing of all of this. As I sit here now, we're busy tweaking the budget. We're past the budget through council, but we're tweaking it because classroom 5A needs webcams if this is going to work properly. And so, which is some stuff that Hadi was actually saying. So the tendency also, we must avoid technological determinism. Sitting in front of a computer, teaching or learning is not getting an education. It isn't. If it was, anybody could actually do it. So we actually need to rethink pedagogy and say what works and what does not work, how are we going to monitor and evaluate, and how are we going to fund all of this. That is going to be important, therefore, for the Department of Higher Education and Training, Science and Innovation to rethink this. We are also, because we're virtual labs at UP and others, how do you teach science using virtual labs? Where do you need people to touch things? Can you teach medical students wholly as medical doctors just online? No, not quite possible. Can you do, we are big, we have a world-leading forestry and agriculture institute at UP, 250 people. We don't pay their salaries, they bring in the grants, right? World-leading, they are funded by industry in South Africa and abroad. But they told me during the pandemic, we at some point got to go to the field and touch the trees and insert computer chips in them and get the data live. So we've created an institute, Engineering 4.0, to actually do that. So if you like to answer your question shortly, is that a tendency, I think, for people not to be reflective and to actually be imaginative about the future. And that is why I think at UP, our slogan going forward is always going to be rethink, reimagine, and reposition on an ongoing, continuous basis. And also understand that education is social much as it is about techniques, skills, and that the knowledge must infuse what you actually do. So next year, I'm bringing in 6 Nobel Prize winners for the first time on the continent going forward. And I've given them the topic, the future of work. So the Nobel Prize winners will engage industry, government, and academia, both in-person and hybrid. And we're then also going to launch a Center for the Future of the Study of the Work, which is about curriculum, training, education, knowledge fused together and the transdisciplinary turn.
Thank you so much. I'm just like feeling like I'm getting that sense from what you've shared with us. Is a question that came up for me, which I just want to leave, but just express, was almost like, how big can you think?
Yeah, yes, I think.
How big can you think, even if you're in survival space?
Yeah, no, I think that in survival space for me, that is the old phrase, you should not waste a crisis. I believe in a different one, which I was taught by my grandmother. Every cloud has a silver lining. And your challenge in a leadership position is to look for that silver lining and expand it. Because when you do not have a crisis, or when there's no dark cloud, you become very complacent. But also, I mean, there's another point, I don't want to hog the stage. There's another point I want to make, is that coming into South Africa in 1999, and even today, I think there are so many structural constraints into the education system, and that keep on not being resolved. That is getting paralyzing for many people, whether it's students' bad debt, throughput rates that are falling government subsidies, and the mismatch between education and training and the skills in the industry in a disrupted environment. There is so much a society can take, but we actually can't give up. So that reimagination is very, very important going forward.
Thank you. Sizwe, may I hand over to you? Any thoughts?
Yes, no, thanks very much. Let me just start by congratulating Prof. Kupe for the direction that UP is taking, especially when it comes to being agile and thinking through some of these things, because I think what universities like UP can do or will do, I think if we, just like any change, dealing with change is really, really difficult for a lot of people. you ask the question of what stops us from doing all of these things like multidisciplinary teaching or transdisciplinary teaching and sorting out the issues that have been outstanding for many years. Very often, it is about the inability or sometimes the fear of dealing with change. So I really just want to, congratulate Prof. Kupe for the direction that UP is taking. And hopefully that starts to create a community of practice where other people see that change actually is beneficial, is positive in a number of areas, even though going through the process itself may be difficult. But I just want to touch on some of these points that were raised, as well as your broader question of what stops us or what sort of stops the system from changing. The first one is just the politics, both politics of at the macro level and politics at the micro level. And I'll just illustrate the point, because I happen to work across government, the institutions, and the private sector. Just in my role as a co-founder of the National Education Collaboration Trust, which works in the basic education system, where we have organized business, we have labor, and we have the system, in other words, the Department of Basic Education. We have organized business as in Business Leadership South Africa, or the sectoral bodies that are represented there. And I think we've made a lot of progress in bringing the private sector to influence what happens in curriculum, in learning and teaching, in ITE, in initial teacher education, and so on. But one thing in that system that just never stops to amaze me, when you talk about initial teacher education as an example, how disconnected basic education is from higher education, as an example. We know the separation took place in 2009, and it just appears that since that separation, those two systems were essentially one system, just never talk to each other again. And yet we have one system, which is a supply side of teachers, and the other system, which is a supply side of learners or students. And the two systems really just don't talk to each other. I look at just what's happened now with COVID in the context of the delay in exams. And, we have the matric results that are going to come out on the 20th of Feb. And I interact quite a lot with that system, and I've been hosting and chairing sessions with civil society, just talking about what's happening with the rewrite of mathematics and physics. And very, very often, I don't even see whether it's USAf or representatives of the universities linked into that system, into the debates and the discussions and conversations that are taking place in that system. I happen to serve on the minister or advisory panel for the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, where we've been trying to influence and address this issue of digital learning and teaching, from devices to broadband access, to how content can be created that's more suitable for blended learning from school right up to universities, an example. But again, very often when we meet as a ministerial task team in DC, there's no one from basic education, there's no one from our, without any input or even understanding of how the education system actually works. And then I come back to the micro political sort of situation within institutions. I serve an accountants for many, many years. And I'm very, very involved with SAICA now as a professional body. At a professional level, you have, other than the universities of technology, all the universities, including the HBUs, are now accredited, at least at the undergraduate program. And here's the thing, we've seen so SAICA since 2014 introduced this multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary concept into their assessment. So you write part one of the CA exam, and then you write the APC, which is the second part of the professional exam. And then many other professional bodies are moving in that direction, like the engineers, the actuaries, the medical faculty is always, or the health sciences faculty have always been, there's always an experiential or practical part of how that system actually works. But the point I want to make here, involvement with the professional body called the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. One of the key reasons and the root causes of why the past, particularly at a rate in the last 4 years, has been working with all the 19, there are 19 universities that are accredited to offer, the CA stream. But, that are doing postgrad. At university level to move towards transdisciplinary within the Faculty of Economic Sciences of the schools of accounting. The lecturing is still done for tax, financial accounting, management accounting, and tax in silos. The profession has moved has hardly moved, except maybe for 1 or 2 universities that are trying to move. So I just look at this, and very often when you engage with the deans or with the academics, you almost get the sense that people sort of think, no, we are experts in what we do, and they don't want to change. So there's that maybe resistance to change or fear to change. And I can mention this in engineering and others, because in USAf, we see this, because we at USAf, which is funding the missing middle, we work with professional bodies like actuaries, engineers, health professional council, obviously accountants and so on. And that's why I know for sure that all these professional bodies are moving in that direction. Universities are very, very resistant to change when it comes to this concept of multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary teaching. So there's a lot of that happens. And I think there's an opportunity here, because when I look at just what I was saying around USAf, which also is set up very similarly to how the NECT is set up. In other words, you have organized business. You have the Banking Association, you have ASISA, you have BLSA. All of these organized business organizations are trying to see how they can influence, for instance, curriculum, pedagogy, learning and teaching at universities. And unless you come as a professional body that has accredited programs at universities, is extremely difficult, even at the level of USAf. I know we've interacted with, for instance, the learning and teaching to try and say, here are things and what we could be doing, which actually would open a lot of opportunities for that stream income, for research and innovation, for partnerships between universities and the private sector, or partners, just like, for instance, in NECT, we have all these 7 teacher unions that are involved there. And therefore, if we could just connect, obviously, appears to be a little bit moribund, but has all of these things around financial sustainability and the quality of the programs that we're facing. The last point, which I did, as I said, I did the analysis, the financial analysis of all the 26 universities in this country. And just going back to the point that Hadi was making, I mean, I've seen a decline, and I can share some of these slides quite quickly here, but I've seen a significant decline in the finances. So there's been an increase on a cumulative basis of the income that's coming from government, from block grants, or even the allocation from NSFAS, for that matter. But when it comes to the third stream income, in 2018 already, we started to see that peaked in 2018 at about 25 billion rand. That number, as of 2019, was down to 19 billion rand. And this year, because obviously part of that is income of endowments that are sitting in markets. And if the markets are down on a net basis at 20%, you can expect that the third stream income is going to be significantly down, just at the end of the financial year that we are in 2020. And that has implications. It means that universities need to start thinking very different around how they can generate that stream income. Because that's why these partnerships become particularly important, because that has a lot to do with the sustainability and the future quality of our university system. And that's why, I do think there's an opportunity now for partnerships. Our president is driving partnerships. I mentioned that I'm part of the Solidarity Fund. We were able to raise money from the private sector, just over 3 billion rand in only a couple of months. In 2 months, we were able to do that. And I think the point I'm making is the private sector is ready to partner, provided, people see value, provided there's a willingness to partner on the other side. And I do think that a lot of universities, especially the universities of technology and the HBUs, the universities of technology, the third stream income is only about 12%. The HBUs, it only sits at about 5%. The other comprehensive universities, it sits at about 33%. So there's a huge opportunity for UTs and HBUs to significantly increase their third stream income, but they have to think very differently about the concept of partnership. They've got to set up proper governance and accountability structures, which often are not in place. I mean, I can talk of a number of cases where you've tried to contribute money. I've raised money for some of the HBUs. They're not even ready to receive the money, let alone account for the money. And all of this can be easily sorted out by just building some capacity in these universities, which actually will more than pay for itself. Thank you very much.
Sizwe, I like your last point, and it's a point I made to Ahmed a little while ago. And I mean, there's no university has any competitive advantage in back-end systems, whether it's procure to pay, whether it's sort of basic administration around cash and others. I'm sure given where we are now, there must be an opportunity to perhaps build one, maybe two shared services platforms that maybe do that for the entire sector. And what you then do is you sort of uplift the standard of the back-end administration at almost any institution that may be battling with that across the country. I think that would also be a lot more cost effective. So it's one that we're having some conversations on, and certainly one that we're working through at UCT at the moment to see that there are other opportunities down that road that perhaps we can uplift the entire sector by putting in, I guess, a scalable system that actually allows the back-end processes of almost any institution to be run virtually or remotely by someone else. So, I mean, the other point that I really liked, Sizwe, was the one you made about engaging, I guess, business and others more. So the example of psycha and accounting graduates for me is a fantastic one. I've had the last 2 years where I've sat down with our auditors and said, the quality of your first year class is really abominable. I'm finding my team are spending more time coaching them on basic stuff they should know. Part of the problem I had is some of them were my graduates too. So it also sort of meant we had a conversation with the accounting department saying, what are you focusing on that we're not getting these first year clerks come in and we're trying to teach them sort of basic accounting concepts. It's all very well at some level to understand, I guess, the higher nuances of whether it be tax or auditing. But when you're sort of missing the really basic accounting skills, I guess overlaid as well with what we'd like to call a bit of common sense of, well, if you look at this, does it make sense versus what you know? So I guess we're almost missing some of the practical elements. And again, I think you hinted at that. But I think the other thing that we sit at now, again, it's the overarching sustainability one, and sort of how we think about the system being higher education, but again, how it interfaces with the needs of society. And so it's probably more than just, I guess, business. I mean, at the end of the day, our graduates are going to be employed in some senses, but it also strikes me that we should also be having more of our graduates who are set up to run their own businesses and be more entrepreneurial. I mean, I must admit, when I look around at some of my friends and others who are successful entrepreneurs, many of them are not university graduates. Some of them haven't even finished school. So I guess we also need to look at that in some senses of how do we bring along those individuals, and how do we perhaps produce, whether it's short programs, whether it's different interventions that sort of generate more people with, I guess, entrepreneurial mindsets, or ones that look at that, because there's very clearly a need for that as well in terms of, I guess, both growing the economy, growing jobs, but also if you think about where a lot of our current youth are looking at, they're back into the sort of the gig economy. The idea of a career for 30 or 40 years in a similar role that maybe has, I guess, different changes in seniority and other, does not really seem to be as appealing to that generation as it may have been to ours. So again, how do we reshape and rethink ourselves? And in terms of what we do as universities, but also in terms of how we support the country around sort of the idea of the gig economy and what those sort of things do. I think there are a lot of opportunities down there. And then again, I think, Bernadette, the question you framed about why change is so hard, I think the two gentlemen with me covered a lot of the really key points, but maybe I may raise one that's perhaps a little controversial. In many respects, when I sort of engage my academic colleagues on the idea of, well, what's the minimum class size for a particular program, whether it be an undergraduate program, as I said earlier, broader humanities disciplines, or whether it be a postgraduate taught masters in law. And when I suggest those sort of minimum class sizes, I'm told I don't understand the academic project. And while I may not understand the finer nuances of teaching, learning, and research, I suspect I do understand them enough to know that I can't teach a class of 3 students an undergraduate degree forever, because at some point, that simply makes no sense financially. It also gets back to the point I made very early on about that strategic compass. At some point, if you understand your vision and your strategy really, really clearly, you can then look at those courses and programs and say, well, do these align with our vision, our mission, and our strategy? If they do, then you can probably argue for retaining them. Obviously, you can't run every program on that sort of basis, otherwise you would no longer be a viable university. But those that don't align, they need to, I guess, terminate, come to an end, whatever you may call it. And the reason we find that very hard to do is by its very nature, academia is hugely collegial. And it's very hard to tell your colleague over the fence that he may not have a job in 3 years' time, because the discipline he teaches is not one that fits with our vision, mission, or strategy. And repeatedly, that seems to be the very, very hard discussion to have with our academic colleagues in terms of how universities are structured and run. So again, I think when we start putting some metrics in place, and again, it can't be the only driver. The strategy has to be a factor. The finances or the bottom line is certainly a factor. But then again, where does that fit socially, or I guess within the fabric of what you want as your society or other? So use a lot of the broad humanities disciplines. I mean, a lot of them are ones that when you look at them financially don't make a lot of sense, but they add a whole lot more to what you produce as a graduate. So it's getting back to how those fit in with what you want to produce as a graduate. So earlier, Tawana talked about UP's, I guess, vision and where they see themselves going. And UCT's one's not too unsimilar. We have a vision aiming at 2030, which we're calling Unleash. So the idea is to unleash human potential, and underpinned to that is to create a fair and just society. So again, you're still looking at the core needs of what do you need to do, but also what sort of individual exits your university in terms of how they fit into the society, what they generate, what they add to that, and seeing how those fit again in a transdisciplinary way. But we can't actually make the investments in these new directions, new ways of teaching, new ways of thinking about blended learning, if we don't stop doing some of the things that we've done for, in some cases, hundreds of years. And I go back to the example of my daughter. I mean, we still, up until the time of this crisis in many institutions, had students sit in rows in lecture theatres. That's Industrial Revolution style teaching. I think we moved a long way past that. And I think Tawana talked to the ideas of how do you create exciting blended learning spaces where you have this idea of some stuff online, different creative spaces to learn, where you sit and work in groups. I mean, I can use my own experience as an undergraduate. I hated lectures. I couldn't see particularly any point in them. I knew what I had to learn. I knew what I had to produce in an exam, and I did that. But when I got to sitting in a postgrad master's class, doing group work, engaging with people at a better level, I got a lot of benefit out of that, and I really enjoyed the process. And again, I've seen more and more of that in terms of how we then engage with our undergraduate students. I see more and more, going back to Sizwe's point about how we think about our school system. I think the more we start reforming our school system again, to sort of use the idea of both group work, collaborative work, I think we set people up better for life, and I think we also educate them far better. So gone a bit of a roundabout, Bernadette, but I'm hoping that's contributed to the conversation.
It has. Thank you so much, Hardy. I'm just thinking, as I've heard you all speak, and Birgit will also come in and just update us on the chat and what's coming through. But what stood out for me is this idea that perhaps the system and our thinking has been lagging behind societal changes. And I like the example you were talking about in relation to your daughter and how entrepreneurship is actually, there's so many people who work in that space and in fact have not been at university. And so it raises again the issue of relevance, but just the idea that we are lagging behind. It seems that universities, like Prof. Cooper has said, they are establishments, and there may be a mindset within that space that actually we've been here for a long time, and we're assuming, the assumption we are making, which hasn't been tested yet and easily can be put to the test, is that we always assume that because we've been here for a long time, we're always going to be here. I want to hand over to Birgit. Please come in just with a follow-up question.
Thanks, Bernie. I'm watching the chat and there's some lovely questions. The one I want to read out to you is from Busisiwe Nkala-Dlamini. So she picks up on the idea that was raised amongst the three speakers on the competition and the unhealthy competition amongst the institutions. And she says it's good to look at the position of the institution and the strengths and to capitalize on that. So the universities will need to look more and play to their strengths more. And maybe I can expand the question and just say, well, what are the barriers to that? How would you recommend the universities just work more to their strengths, to focus more on what is working and not duplicate so much?
Could I perhaps start? This is a bit of a hobby horse for me. So what many may not know is at the sort of emergence of merged institutions, I did academic viabilities and actually chaired the audit committee at what is now the University of Venda, as well as Tshwane University of Technology. So I think, I mean, it's a good question. I think the first thing to go back is, and again, it's going to sound awful coming from me, but not every institution should aspire to be a UCT. We don't need a country full of UCTs or UPs. I mean, I did an induction session for our SRC a couple of weeks ago, and I have another one coming up. And one of the standard questions I put to our SRCs is you know, again, we sort of have ingrained somehow in our students who come into our institutions that the only way to, I guess, change your life, change your trajectory in life is a university degree, and that's patently incorrect. I suspect if you go and look at anybody who wants to go live in Australia or New Zealand, if you're a plumber or electrician, well, you're in sort of the pound seats. And so I sort of get back to the idea that you know, if we all turn out the same cookie cutter accountants or other, I don't think that's terribly helpful. But use the Univen example, and here I'll sort of link into the point that Tawana made earlier. Univen has an excellent agriculture department. It's located exactly in the north, as he said. Let's focus on the strengths. UCT probably is never going to have that. Stellenbosch may have a department that focuses on the wine industry. So again, location and what's relevant to the area. So it's almost getting back to, I guess what I also see as an emerging theme and is a bit of a passion of mine is situating both the qualification within the region the university finds itself in. What's relevant? What's in the area? What does it do? I think that's a good starting point. But I think that the first one is to almost dispel the notion and get some agreement that having a country full of UCTs or UPs is not a good place to start. And again, somehow we've got that notion in our heads, and I don't know where it came from, and I'm not sure I know how to change it, that is the best for the country. I certainly don't think it is.
Yeah, if I may, you know, some of these things, I just think of, for instance, if you look at universities of technology, you know, they have a particular history, and when they were transformed a couple of years ago to be universities of technology, you found suddenly that most of them, I'm just using them as an example, you know, sort of move and they want to be similar to comprehensive universities. or traditional universities as an example. So, and yet when you look at this country, especially in the context of, unfortunately, a TVET system which is not working as it should, and there's a lot of issues. I really do think, I mean, we'll look at, for instance, our country's industry, the innovation industry, whether it's in the pharmaceutical sector, the biotech sector, renewable energy sector, agricultural sector. There are just so many areas, the technology sector, there are just so many areas where, I just pick universities of technology as an example. They could really hold their own in terms of offering programs that were relevant, that were really doing a lot in employment creation or promoting particular industries or innovation or entrepreneurship as an example. But I think when I look at them and I do the analysis and I read a lot of the annual reports, a lot of universities of technology want to be like traditional or comprehensive universities. And I'm like, well, we have a situation in a country with high levels of unemployment that we have, and UTs could really be playing a very, very important role in our innovation in the country, in our industry, various industries that we have, in promoting and supporting them and doing research and so on. And the same applies to HBUs. So if I look at, Hardy spoke about Venda. If I look at Venda, Limpopo, Walter Sisulu, Zululand, and maybe to a lesser degree, UWC, these universities sit in particular locations. Yes, they have an apartheid history in terms of where they are located, but I don't think they've really leveraged the competitive advantage which they have based on their location. I just look at the Eastern Cape as an example, just with tourism, with the oceans, which they have, and obviously they're not the only university that is close to the ocean. You have Nelson Mandela, UKZN, DOT, and UNIZUL, as well as the Western Cape universities. But I'm not aware there's a vibrant faculty that's exploring and exploiting the agricultural sector that sits in the Eastern Cape, or that exploits the biodiversity that sits in the Eastern Cape, as an example. And I think between UFH and WUSU, they don't need to compete with Rhodes or with NMU. I think they have particular competitive advantages which they have because of their locations to leverage of that. And part of that may require, especially when you have universities that have multiple campuses and so on, there's a huge opportunity to rationalize some of the PQM and some of the programs which they have, because if we have 4 campuses like WUSU, or you have 3 campuses like UFH, as an example, you just need to unpack that. Suddenly you find that there's duplication in a lot of things that they offer in Umtata, Queenstown, Butterworth and East London. And maybe there are even opportunities for much more collaboration between, say, a UFH and WUSU. I'm just taking those 2 as an example. Just like there are major opportunities in the agricultural sector and the mining sector for UL, for University of Limpopo, to collaborate with the University of Venda. And there could be, Pan-African in those areas where they collaborate and use their strength, as opposed to look at those 2 universities and complain the fact that they don't have that stream income. I think there's a competitive advantage which they have, which they're really just not exploiting. And for me, the opportunity just sits there for them to do something about that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Kupe. Thanks.
Well, yeah, I think my colleagues have covered the notion of differentiation very well. But I also wonder whether, because in many higher education systems, the literature will show is that where there is public funding, you use public funding to steer universities in different directions. So the funding mechanism now, I think in a sense, is not steering sufficiently, let me put it that way, if there is failure on the management side. In other words, you are incentivized for what is good for you. Right now, the funding system, I think, gives incentives for everything for everybody. So hence also partly a lack of, so I think that needs to be rethought and reimagined so that there are pockets of the funding mechanism says to you, your response to your context is going to be very, very important. And do not see yourself as similar to university Y, if you like. And so I think that in that way, in that way, there will be steering of the system in particular in specific directions. Right now, I think the measures of the early 2000s, what they did actually was to steer away universities of technologies which were technicals. So, for example, Technical in Pretoria was good at producing technicians for the SABC and the broadcast industries. Now I understand they are not necessarily that strong. I don't have sufficient evidence myself. I speak to my colleague, but that's what I hear. But now, because they are now called a university, not necessarily a technical, because in the UK as well, when they did these universities of technology, a similar effect happened, where they also then now the universities, institutions, politics that were normally technology focused, skills based, technical skills, technocratic skills, became also to play the research intensive game, and lots of funding appeared to be placed in that pot, if you like. So part of what I'm suggesting is a reimagining of the system is not to have this situation where, in part, it's an inherited system. That's why we still talk about historically black universities and historically white universities. Then, in part, is a steering, it's a restructuring of the 2000 that led people with a mixed identity. They a university of technology, but also they then want to do research in that space so that the funding might actually be much more steering. And regional collaborations. In the UK, for example, universities in the same regions have alliances. So when I left WITS, I suggested to my colleagues we create a Gauteng research triangle of universities in Gauteng. And I think 3 universities have come off the block to create that alliance. We're doing some research on health data, for example, UJ, UP, and WITS. It might be that VUT and TUT also could do that kind of alliance, because if they get into this other alliance, the confusion of identity might actually continue. But Bernadette, I see your question there. If you don't mind, I can transition to it. One way you say, how can we break silos and reimagine boundaries in various places, e.g. transdisciplinary research? I think the big driver really is that even from the NRIF and other funding agencies, we must actually ask more of universities for societal impact. Because with societal impact, and I think my 2 colleagues mentioned it as well, you see, the interesting thing about societal challenges and problems is that they do not come packaged in disciplinary silos or in university silos. They require a society, it's a response to a societal challenge. And often, I mean, if you had spoke about climate change is not an issue of science only. It's also an issue of the social sciences, the humanities more broadly, even the arts, engineering, technology, health. You can't resolve the climate challenge by simply looking at the science of climate change only and not looking at how climate change impacts on human lives and also impacts on. It was just like what the pandemic did. It was not just a health crisis, it became an economic crisis with shutdowns. You destroyed the economy was shut down, people lost their jobs and their livelihoods, compounded other health conditions that already exist. So to deal with COVID-19 or the pandemic as simply a health crisis is to miss the bigger picture. Remember also, if you go here at UP, we have a Center for Viral Zoonosis. That is those diseases that it is believed are transmitted from disruptions in the environment leading to viruses in animals into human beings. Now, if you're going to understand this and ensure that pandemics don't have such a devastating impact, you got to go to that science, but also you got to go to human behavior and human interactions, and also you got to go back to whether shouldn't the economy now be organized in such a way that it addresses the climate change challenge, just transitions to a green economy, for example. So clearly, I think that if we stop talking about simply research leagues and rankings that rank the university number 1, 2, based on how many papers have been written, how many medals, how many citations, that I think should be taken as common cause. The challenge really should be, then what? How do you translate your research, your wonderful book, your knowledge, your journal papers into societal solutions? That societal solutions must really be based on high quality knowledge, but a person who ends only with high quality knowledge in a library, in a database, he's actually failed in a sense to actually the societal challenge. Because at the end of the day, an education, including research and co-creation of knowledge, should be about solving societal challenge. We all know that that cannot be solved in a seminar room, in a library, in a study. You actually have to deal with real living individuals and institutions, communities, and deal with the context and all of that. So I think that the push away from football league rankings will help us very much in actually addressing to begin to, if there's to be any ranking, it should be a ranking about, okay, what did your knowledge and training lead to solving, which societal challenges? Did you address the 17 sustainable development goals as one measure, for example?
Excellent. Thank you so much for those contributions. Birgit, I just want to check, are there any comments you'd like for us to feed through?
I think we're fine on the question. There was a question around the funding that I saw. There was a comment made about how hard it is for the sector to recover its funding. But Bernadette, I wonder, that you keep emphasizing, how do we rethink new things? So just, focusing on claiming debt is perhaps not a question you want to focus on now. So it's, up to you.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Colleagues, I think we're drawing to a close now, and I would like to invite the discussants just to share their last thought with us. By way of concluding, I thought perhaps you could share with us what is the top point from what you've heard here and shared here today that you would like us to take away with us as we think about our own leadership role within the universities. I think for me, what stood out certainly from what you've been saying is that financial planning and thinking about excellence and sustainability is really about thinking about your strategy, thinking about your vision, thinking about what the purpose is, what the repurposing should be as part of that financial planning. It's not a standalone. But at this stage, I want to invite you to share with us your top key point you would like us to take away with us as we think about our own leadership and management role within the universities. Prof. Cooper, and then we can just go full circle.
For me, at the risk of repeating myself, I should say that we should think societal impact and transformation, transformative higher education, and then work backwards towards that. And say, if we're going to have a higher education that is transformative of society, creates a prosperous, genuinely democratic, just, equal, equitable, and sustainable society, how do we organize our university education, and who delivers? How do you distribute, if you like, the heavy lifting, or who should do what in what context? And then how do we actually incentivize and fund that? Because if we don't think about that way, we could have a situation, there are many African countries, by the way, with very highly educated people, but that has not had an impact on the kind of society that they have. And that also has lots of human resources and natural resources, but they become unsustainable societies in multiple ways than one.
Yeah, well, can I come in, Dr. Bernadette?
Please, thank you.
Right. So, for me, there are three things. One, which talks to the point that Prof. Cooper has just mentioned, the funding formula is long overdue for review. And I really honestly think that, yes, this formula, which is based on the block grants, which looks at teaching inputs and outputs and research inputs and outputs, really needs urgent review. I do think we need a formula of funding which looks at and not just the academic program as in the structure of the PQM, which supports our strategy as a country, whilst we generating knowledge and innovation, but also looks at each category of university and the impact that they have in society as well as the local economy. You know, various countries have come up with formulas to be able to do this. We need to design our own. And it is a real pity for me that, you know, this was supposed to happen almost in 2018, 2019. It was overtaken by #FeesMustFall. So we ended up with short-termism at the expense of thinking long-term about what our university structure and system should look like. I think we still have a very strong university system, but if it continues on the current trajectory, it is weakened every day and every year and every 3 years and so on. So that is really important. And the second point is around the universities themselves. You know, as I was going through the universities' annual reports, looking at their strategies versus what they actually do, I found a lot of disconnect. You know, the intentions and the stated missions that sit in universities and what they do, especially in terms of how they manage, you know, obviously I was looking at it from a vantage point of just the finances, how they look like and where they go and where they've gone over the last couple of years. You know, I find that there's a huge amount of low-hanging fruit. The question, you know, which Hadi actually talked to, because UCT is one of the few universities, Hadi, that does what you do in terms of costing your PQM the way you do. The majority by far of universities don't do that. So even the conversations that you're having with academics, at least you're having them. Other universities are not even having those conversations because they do not know and they have not done the exercise. And that can unleash and unlock a huge amount of value, of money that can be used to improve the quality of the academic programs in those universities. And it's just amazing when you unpack the numbers and you look at them. So that's the second thing, which I just wanted to touch on. The third thing is there are major opportunities. I think the private sector that I'm much closely involved with is ready to work with the education system, both the basic education system and the higher education system. And I think we're missing a huge opportunity here. And part of it just, you know, are simple things that universities can do. Set up governance structures to, I know there are universities that do this quite well, especially those that are sitting with big reserves and endowments. I won't mention them because I know them. They're mainly in the Western Cape, 2 of them that are sitting with more than 50% of the endowments in the country of the university system. But the point is really, there's a lot that all universities can do to raise third stream income, whether it is contract for research or it is just endowments. And a lot of universities do not even have, they may have foundations, but those foundations are completely emasculated, are not properly resourced to focus on the third stream income. So there's a huge amount of opportunity which sits there that universities are not even just leveraging off. Let alone the leakage on the expenditure side of all universities that can really, really help improve, you know, where we are as a country. And even if you look at it in the context of rankings, which I agree with Prof. Kupe, I think there are unintended consequences in terms of how the rankings, you know, people think about the rankings, you know, in this country. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Hardy, there's a question that's coming up here by Nelly Sharpley asking, can you please take us back on the costing of the PQM? So I thought that's an issue you've just been complimented on. Maybe you could elaborate a bit more. And someone else saying, yeah, Busisewe saying, I can identify with the exclusion. Very interesting, Prof. Kupe. I'm not sure what your thoughts may be on the exclusion of academics when financial decisions are made. Not that that happens, of course, at your institution, but just a question there for us to think about.
Look,
Thanks,
I think my two colleagues have made many of the points I would make, but I mean, I think I'd go back to underlining sort of in the first instance to using the funding framework revisit as one of the driving tools in terms of how you differentiate the sector. And I think back that idea of what I call, I guess, localized institutions. And I think both Sizwe and Tawana put that very well. I think that is one way to get back to where we need to be. That I think will also then help in terms of breaking down some of the silos. Then I think the other one, which some of us do very well and others less so, is also again trying to break down the silos between institutions. Certainly in the last 10 years within the sector, I think we've got a lot better at sharing experiences, sharing expertise, sharing thoughts around how we think things can be done better. And certainly I think that's testament to having a cohort of vice chancellors who I think about things certainly a lot more openly than I think perhaps their predecessors that do. And I think there's a lot of compliment in that to our current cohort of VCs. I think then finally the other point, and I mean I won't get to the PQM because although Sizwe has given us a compliment, I think we're pretty awful at it. But I think in terms of looking at this, I mean, so we spend quite a lot of time trying to communicate things. But universities are already odd places from that perspective, is you can try doing, whether it's via an email, whether it's trying to present to the DAC or a faculty board or other, you'll always have 5 people you miss who then tell you, I don't understand how that works, or I never understood those financial aspects of how they trade off. So we can only keep on doing those. I mean, for me, that's one very big positive out of how we've worked this year, is that certainly I've had a lot more of my academic colleagues in particular attend just an hour and a half long session where we do, for example, Finance 101, Subsidy Formula 101. How does this thing fit together? What does it do in terms of driving behavior? So I think certainly that's been a big positive. I think the last point I want to leave, and it's probably not directly related to this session, but in some ways it is. And it's my word for 2020 is relentless. And the problem with relentless is we focus then too much on just trying to get the next operational thing done, and we kind of lose our strategy, our focus again. Where do we want to be in 10, 15 years time? And we had a set of management consultants my VC got in, and they sadly used my diary as an example. And I've averaged 11.5 hours per day in online meetings since March. And if you think about doing that, then you think about how much you're doing in terms of strategic planning. You're doing very, very little. So it's also then, again, trying to balance how we get back to having the time and space to actually think creatively about things, and actually how we then make those change decisions in terms of where we want to be. I think not just, it's not going to be unique to my institution or my circumstance. I would guess that almost everybody in this room has had similar experiences during 2020. So part of how we reimagine our curriculums, kind of how we reimagine how our professional administration and other staff and leaders work, is actually working out how to make the space that we can get back to thinking about the strategies and having the time to contemplate them. How we do that, I think, actually underpins almost everything else.
So about the exclusion of academics, I see an interesting chart there about where they are talking about. I was there, and I can say that when I was there, that didn't happen. But anyway, here is the answer: is we have to strike a balance between, when it comes to the budget of the finances of the university, between the governance and the field judiciary responsibilities. Council is responsible for that. However, what management ought to do is to avoid two extremes. A situation where every academic wants a piece of the budget for themselves. Where is my piece of the cake? That would not work. It would lead to financial chaos. But a situation, but then also come somewhere to the middle where those responsible for budgets consult with academics at whatever level and come to the appropriate committees and structures to input into the budget. I can tell you now, having been a Deputy Vice Chancellor for Finance and Operations, this is not something you could put in the Senate room for a discussion by every academic. You would never get anywhere. Some of it, as Hadi says, people say they don't understand. But some degree of transparency, substantive and meaningful consultation is important. So what I've done at UP, I've created a committee called Strategic Planning and Allocation of Resources Committee. It is a couple of independent academics who know something about finances, but also representatives of deans and executive members. That then, as Hadi says, we try and let the information flow, but people should also read their emails and also respond when we ask for tips for the budget and they don't then respond.
Thanks, Prof. Cooper. I feel like we just got a bit of a beating there as academics.
Really, no, I'm sorry if it came out like that, but I'm trying to show you the complexity of how it should be handled. In institutions, by the way, where they haven't handled this properly, they are, they are almost in administration, or the finances do not go where they should go.
I think that's a fantastic point. It's trying to find the balance. It's incredibly hard to do that. And I think, whether you sit in management or other, Prof. Cooper can make the point he does. If I make it, I'd probably be shot. So it's always nice to hear my academic colleagues make it.
Thank you so much, colleagues. And Prof. Cooper, Busisi was asking a good question here. Why on earth did you leave WITS? Thank you for leaving a very good transformation office intact, which I now am working in. So thank you very much for the legacy you've left us with. It has put us in a very good space to carry on your good work.
Yeah, my answer is very simple, and I see Dr. Judy Jamin is there, so if I answer this wrong, she will deal with me. But let me say that to a certain extent, my work was done. There was an opportunity at UP and their sister universities. Now we have a research alliance together, and Dr. Jamin is still my chancellor.
That's wonderful. I think that's such a good note to conclude on. I think that as we thought today about change and what might be stopping us, I felt a lot of it was pointing back to our own complacency. And you at that point knew your work was complete and it was time to stretch yourself in a new space with its new challenges. And I suppose this speaks very well into the idea of us thinking very differently about what we do, Adi. While we appreciate that we're drawn into this space of having to keep going 11, 12-hour days Zooming, we also have an opportunity to maybe think over the vacation, think over the next few days about how might we think differently about what we're doing? Because I think thinking differently about what we're doing feeds into repositioning, reimagining, repurposing an entire university and with that system. So I'd like to, in conclusion, thank all the panelists for their contribution today. Thank you, Professor Cooper, for taking time out and spending it with us. Thank you very much for the good and excellent work you do in the system. Thank you, Mr. Sizwe Nkosana. It was wonderful to be in your presence with all your extensive experience and the work you do from the private sector into the public space for the public good. It is so important and we value your leadership. Mr. Hardy Maritz, thanks for your incredible insights on what you bring into the system and how you get to shake up our thinking for us not to remain complacent and comfortable with what is, but rather to stretch ourselves into what could be. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to thank you, Dr. Dlamini. UP as a VITSI, which is good for collaboration. We're going to take you up, Prof. Cooper. Good for collaboration, which will help to reimagine. So, good point. Thanks, Dr. Dlamini. And also thank you and colleagues, attendees. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'll see you back on Event Mobi for the closing. Keep well. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.